resumption of the interrupted debate.
I call the Leader of the House and the member for Heffron.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I was not going to participate in this debate. As the only Jewish member of the government, of the only Jewish member of the House, and the child of a Holocaust survivor, I considered that any view I expressed would not be seen to be objective. And during all these anti-Semitic attacks, I have effectively relied on the Premier to speak on behalf of the government in relation to a response to these, and left it to the leaders of the Jewish community to speak for all Jews, including me. However, after I heard the contribution from the member for Bathurst, which surprised me because I go back quite some time with the member for Bathurst, I thought that I needed to respond and say something. My mother was liberated, having been incarcerated in a number of concentration camps during World War II, and her parents were murdered at Kelaliva in Estonia. I have stood on those sand dunes in the middle of the forest in Kelaliva, Estonia, knowing that my grandparents' remains lay under my feet, together with thousands of other Jews shot naked into trenches. Nearly all of my mother's family and extended family, when they were taken firstly from Morris Schoenberg to Prostěv and then to Theresienstadt, ended up in Auschwitz, where they were murdered in the gas chambers. My father was sent out of Austria just before the Anschluss, and he was fortunate to be able to, at his own father's instigation, escape Austria before the Anschluss and escape to what was then known as Palestine. My mother and father met in Prostěv in Czechoslovakia after the war, and they married, and they left in 1947, came to Australia in 1948 as the communists took control of Czechoslovakia. They came to Australia for a number of reasons. The most important reason of which they came to Australia was they came to a country that had liberal democracy, a country that welcomed immigrants, a country that gave a go to immigrants, a country that was free and had free speech, and a country where Australians had an inbuilt feeling of egalitarianism and an inbuilt nation that gave everybody a fair go. My parents kept from me the horrors that they faced during the Holocaust. My mother did, during my lifetime, give an interview to the Spielberg Foundation. I came towards the end of it, and if anyone's interested, they'll see her interview. I've uploaded it onto YouTube, and it's something that I only found after she passed away. And that gives some indication of the horrors that she underwent, something that she kept from me and my sister. Growing up in Sydney, in the area in which I still live, like all minorities, often there were remarks made that might be regarded as anti-Semitic, but all minorities faced them. Whether somebody made some reference to the size or shape of my nose, which seems to be consistent with much of the Jews in the world, whether or not your spending patterns related to your religion, those comments were often made. But as those sort of comments are often made from other minority ethnic groups, it just seemed to have been usually in the 60s and 70s and 80s, the Australian way. You never took offence, or you learnt to live with it. In my lifetime, I have never seen or witnessed the extent of the anti-Semitism and the anti-Semitic attacks that have been so concentrated really since the 7th of October, nearly 18 months ago. Never has that occurred. The response to these anti-Semitic attacks by the Premier, the government, the opposition leader and their views have been swift. Bearing in mind this, that for 30 centuries, humanity, various sections of human history have tried to exterminate Jews. For 30 centuries have they faced persecution and extermination, but they're still here. The Jews believe that they're still here because of God, but we are still here. And if you look through human history and the persecution of the Jews, it always starts with the conduct of which this bill addresses, and it starts with hate speech, before it then progresses to blaming the Jews as a minority, which ultimately impacts on a variety of government decisions and loss of human rights. It's just consistent throughout the history of humanity. With this conduct, and of course, frighteningly, what the Attorney General happens to tell us from information that the police provide in relation to intelligence, there are a number of reasons of which to be concerned. And it is important that the Parliament respond, governments respond, but what's so fundamental is that response is on a bipartisan single basis. Australia has never faced this before. New South Wales and Sydney's never faced this before, to this extent and at this level of threat, and it requires a bipartisan response. It does not require, nor can it possibly require, any member of any political party to seek to obtain a political benefit of this behaviour, which human history tells us easily continues and get worse. I know that oppositions, particularly in a first term, are struggling for relevance. But there's a time for leadership, there's a time for community leadership, and there is a time for statesmanship. The member for Bathurst is the former Deputy Premier of this state. He should know better than to come into this House on this bill and launch an attack over matters he knows absolutely nothing about. To be able to assert that the government's failed a vulnerable religious community when most Jews are not religious. Most Jews are secular, but they are, as you can tell from these anti-Semitic attacks, no distinguishing between whether they're religious or not. To say that they're forced to hire security, well, somebody like me who regularly goes to a synagogue can tell you, whose kids went to a Jewish school, then there has always been security to protect synagogues, parishioners, and Jewish schools, always. At every single function, members of the House would have accepted invitations to a variety of Jewish functions. There is extensive security as you enter into those functions well before those attacks. For the member for Bathurst to demonstrate his ignorance for political purposes is extremely disappointed. Do they live in fear? They do live in fear. I mean, I've been told that I should not be walking to the synagogue on Shabbat. I should not be walking down the streets. I've been told that I should be dropped off right in the presence of security and collected right in the presence of security. Something that I don't like to do. But I can tell you, and I can tell the member for Bathurst, that during your 12 years in government, when he was a Minister of the Crown, there have been a variety of anti-Semitic attacks. For him to come in here and want to distill the dates of anti-Semitic attacks that have occurred during the Minns government being in office, what about those that occurred when he was a Minister of the Crown? What did he do about it? What did he do about it when I would be abused walking to the synagogue on Yom Kippur he did nothing. He wouldn't have even known about it. Deputy Speaker, I might have an extension of time.
The member seeks an extension of time. Is the extension granted? Yes. The extension's granted.
You know, when the rabbi at Maroubra, the former rabbi of Maroubra, was told by a neighbour, more of you people should have been gassed. What did the member for Bathurst, as Deputy Prime Minister or local government minister, do about it? He was too busy merging councils, contrary to his own written promise. So, I mean, I can list all the anti-Semitic abuse that has been suffered by people that are walking to Maroubra Synagogue on Shabbat. I mean, it has been for many years that they can't walk to Shabbat with a kippah on, that they're wearing baseball caps to cover their kippahs because of abuse. So to come into this House and attack this government rather than offering bipartisan approach, I think, for someone I quite like Tooley, I think is just a bloody disgrace. And quite frankly, I say this: at any point in time, the opposition could have come to the government on a bipartisan cooperative basis and made suggestions. These responses are not easy because of the implied constitutional requirements of freedom of political communication. The third bill that the attorney gave notice of today is even more difficult than these two. Why can't members of this House demonstrate some leadership and constructive leadership? Do you think the Jewish community who's looking for a response to these anti-Semitic attacks are really going to appreciate this level of behaviour? I mean, the opposition have come to us before on matters in relation to the Jewish community without fanfare. I mean, the member for Vaucluse came to me last year on behalf of the Rabbinical Council for some financial support, and I quietly, with the Minister of Multiculturalism, organised a grant for the Rabbinical Council without shouting or shepherding or without arguing in the House. But this particular issue required a bipartisan response. This particular issue required the opposition, if it wanted the government to take quicker action or if it wanted the government to do something in particular during all these levels of attack, always had an open door policy. Those on the other side of the House know that every minister of the Minns government has an open door policy to members of Parliament, irrespective of their political persuasion or whether they're a member of the crossbench. And on an issue like this that calls out for a bipartisan approach, I've got to say certain members of the opposition, not all of them, certain members of the opposition have failed. This doesn't require a political response. It requires a bipartisan, unified response from both political parties to send the message out that these acts, anti-Semitic acts, will not be tolerated by the Parliament of New South Wales within the state of New South Wales. That's what it needs to do. Because before we can build community harmony with a variety of other organisations, faith groups, people with diverse views about a conflict on the other side of the planet, we have to start to indicate what our views are in respect of this particular behaviour. And if the cause of this organised anti-Semitic behaviour is as police intelligence suggests, then of course this state and this nation has a significant problem on its plate. And the only way to address it is by a unified approach by this Parliament. And I've got to say, not as a member of the Minns government, not as a member for Heffron, but as a Jew and the only Jew in the House, I find the approach of some members of the opposition, including my friend, the manager of opposition business, to be quite disappointing, and someone who I think the world of, the member for Bathurst, I find his approach to have been an absolute disgrace.
I thank the member. The question is the bill be now read a second time.